Hey everybody, this video is going to be related to Cain and Abel. Now, what I'm going to be discussing in this video related to Cain and Abel is its prophetic meaning and how it's related to biblical locations within the Bible. We're about to discover how learning the Hebrew definitions of the names in Bibles can lead you to knowing what the actual meaning of the scripture is. Many people see the story of Adam and Eve and the stories of Cain and Abel as sort of like a not real story. They see it more of as a parable. And I'm going to demonstrate how these, looking up the definition of the names written in the story of the Garden of Eden and the story of Cain and Abel can open up your mind to a completely different meaning of the story. So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10. And it says, "And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted, and became into four heads." Now, first off, we need to know Eden. Where is it? What does it mean? If you look up the etymology of the word Eden, it will translate to mean the steppes or the plains. Now, where are the steppes? Where are the plains? Do you know? Well, if you look at a world map and type in on Google, or you can actually just look at a geographic map that has locations of places, landmarks, geography. Well, the steppes can be found in primarily two specific locations. One of these locations is across the entire European and Asian continent within the area that's right above the Caucasus Mountains, right above the Caspian Sea, starting around there in the Hungary area, in the Europe area, and it goes through Ukraine into what's known as the Western Steppes, which is above Kazakhstan. Then it goes into the Altai Mountains, which is in the Eastern Steppes, which goes into Mongolia. Think of the Mongolian Empire. And then it goes into Manchuria area, which is close to the China, or in China, or above China, actually, slightly above. And it cuts off going into Siberia. So this entire area is like a big rectangle of Eden. Now, there is more than this that's related to Eden. The steppes can also be found in what's known as the plains in America, the Central Plains area. This is also a steppes environment. Okay, so this is our steppes and plains. Then, if you go to Genesis chapter 4, verse 16, here we're going to be talking about the land of Nod. Now, it says, "And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden." Okay, so on the east of Eden, on the east of the steppes. Now, back in the day, we had an ice age, according to historians, and this ice age would have covered up the steppes and the plains across all of Europe and across what's known as the Bering Strait, which led into the crossing of the Bering Strait to get to North America, which would have been east of Eden, east of the steppes, east of the plains. Now, the Bering Land Bridge led to the settlement along the Mississippi, and the Mississippi goes all the way down to the south where Louisiana currently is. Back in the day, they just settled along the Mississippi River Valley, and it covered like a circle area. Now, Nod translates to mean, the etymology of it means the land of the fugitive or the land of the wanderer. Native Americans are known as wanderers. Now, it can also translate to mean the vagabond, the land of the vagabond, or the wandering exile. So think of America. Whenever it was first created, was it not created by people who were fleeing the British colonies? Land of the exiles. The Jews were deported into this land of that day and age. This was where pretty much all the Jews throughout the countries started being put on ships. This is when all the African slave ships started being put on ships. This was a land of exile. Now that we've discussed that, I want to go a little bit further into Genesis chapter 4. Now, we're going to be discussing the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. And we're going to be looking at the meanings of the names of like Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. I could have discussed Cain and Abel in that Genesis 4 verse 16 right then, but we're going to get to that in just a moment, okay? I want to start from the beginning and work my way through. So, in Genesis 4 verse 1, it says, and Adam. Now, Adam, many people know that Adam can mean the earth or the red man. What many people don't know is that Adam can also translate to mean produce. Think of vegetables, the stuff you eat. Now it says, and Adam, or the produce, knew, or another word for new, or words for new, is to make oneself known to. So in other words, the produce made itself known to Eve. The gathering for binding is what Eve translates to mean, or the crops, or the modest one, the proclaimed one. So in other words, the crops, they bear fruit, do they not? Like, for example, trees, you get fruit, apple, oranges, that kind of thing. From crops, you can pull carrots out of the ground, or turnips, or anything. So the gathering for binding, they're gathering up the wheat. Think of that. They gather up the wheat. They bind the wheat for storage into a barn. So let's read this together. And the produce made itself known to the crops, his wife, or his child bearer. Now, don't take me as trying to say that women are only good for childbearing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just using the definition of wife. So, and the produce made itself known to the crops, his child bearer, and she conceived, or created, and bare, or exposed, or undressed. Cain means the spear, the thrusting shaft to light. Now, whenever I say this, I'm talking about, for example, here's the ground. Then it thrust to light, the germination process. You just had something come out to light. You got it? The spear that thrust out to light, the stem, the shoot, the first coming out of the ground. Okay? So here, his wife or childbearer, she conceives or creates and bears or undresses or exposes itself. Cain. So, and bear Cain, or undresses the spear, undresses the shaft to light, and said, I have gotten a man. Man can mean farmer, or it can mean a flower. Now, you can find the comparison of man to a flower later on in our discussion. In Psalms, I believe it's 103. I'll just go ahead and look for it real quick. I already have it prepared in my notes for this video. So let me just scroll forward, and then I'll go back to it, back to where we were. All right. Give me a second. It's a lot of notes, and this is going to be a video that's covering how the story of Cain and Abel is related to the pollination process, basically, is what we're discussing. How it's related to the flower being pollinated by bees, and so on. So let's see. All right, it's Psalms 103:15, not 103:5, but Psalms 103:15, where man is compared to being a flower, okay? You can look up 103:15 yourself. Now I'm going to go back to where I was. All right, so here, but Cain, or we're still in verse 2, the spear, the thrusting shaft to light. Wait, I skipped a part. I ended on verse 1 where it says, and I have gotten a man, or a flower from the Lord, the eternal marriage. Lord can translate to mean eternal marriage. And then verse 2, and she again bare, expose, undress his brother, or his chief. Brother, another word of another way of translating brother in Hebrew, the symbols for brother is chief. So undressed his chief. And then Abel means the natural flowing stream. Think water. Or the meadow. It can mean the meadow. Or the endurance, or enduring one. Let's look at it as meaning the natural flowing stream into the meadow. Think of how back in the days of the Paleo Indians, that irrigation type deal, or how the rivers naturally flowed to the mouth, which emptied off into the Gulf in North America. So keep that in mind when you think of the natural flowing stream. So, and she again exposed, undressed his chief, otherwise known as Abel, the natural flowing stream. And Abel, the natural flowing stream, was a keeper, a gatekeeper, an observer of sheep, or rushing waters and devastation. But Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft to light, was a tiller, or a husbandman, a plowman of the ground, the threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge. So where people did not live, the unoccupied place of discharge. Okay? And in process of time, it came to pass that Cain, the rib, the stalk, the spear, the thrusting shaft, brought, or originated, of the fruit, the produce of the ground, the threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge, an offering, a sacrifice and oblation unto the Lord, the eternal marriage. And Abel, the natural flowing stream, the meadow, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat, or the marrow, a white-fleshed, green-skinned gourd, which is eaten as a vegetable. Or it can be the marrow as in the middle of the bone thereof. And the Lord, or the eternal marriage, had respect, or gazed upon, or looked and married. Think of Matthew 5:28, where those who even look, so much as look upon another woman, has committed themselves to marriage. This is where that phrase comes from. Whenever it's talking about the, Abel in verse 4, the natural flowing stream, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat, the marrow, the white flesh, green skinned gourd. Think of corn. So he brought forth corn and thereof, and the eternal marriage. Now the eternal marriage, think of how mankind, not the flower, but mankind, to survive, must eat of the field, of the vegetables. Okay? So the eternal marriage, the eternal way of survival between mankind and the ground, this eternal, as long as we live, we will have to eat. Okay, so this is your eternal marriage. Had respect, or had gazed upon, looked and married. Matthew 5:28 comparison. Unto Abel. So in other words, the Lord had respect. The Lord gazed upon, or the Lord looked and married unto Abel. So the Lord married the natural flowing stream. So in other words, the Lord became one with this natural flowing stream that went into the meadow. So the Lord is now this river. He is one with this river that flows into the meadow to water the crops. And to his offering, sacrifice and oblation. Verse 5. But unto Cain the spear, the thrusting shaft, and to his offering, or sacrifice and oblation, he had not respect, or he had not married, or he had not looked upon. And Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft, was very wroth, or kindled. Think of setting fire, or he was warmed by the sun. He was warmed up, he was kindled. And his countenance, or his face and splendor, fell. Fell can also mean perished, like a plant. Whenever it's exposed to the sunlight for too long, or for a certain period of time during its life, it starts to wilt. A flower will start to wilt. Okay? And the Lord, or the eternal marriage, said unto Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft to light, Why art thou wroth, or kindled? And why is thy countenance, or face and splendor, fallen or perished? If thou doest here in verse 7 can translate to mean cross. Oh, did you know that the cross was in the story of Cain and Abel? It is. If thou doest, or cross, well can translate to mean the pit. So here we're going to read it where well means pit and doest means cross. So if thou cross the pit, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou cross not the pit, cleanse it is basically what it's saying. Sin means cleansing, or cleanse it. Lay it down to rest is what lieth means. So cleanse it, lay it down to rest at the door, or door can mean at the delivery spot, or at the two-leaved gate. Two-leaved gate, open and shut. Okay? Sort of like your hands open and shut. Two-leaved, think of how Adam and Eve, they wore the fig leaves on the front and the back to cover their private parts. Now I want you to think of the two-leaved gate as how you germinate seeds. Two-leaved gate, sort of like you're covering the seed inside of soil within two leaves. Nowadays, they put it inside, put seeds inside of a paper napkin, put water on top of it, and then put it in a plastic bag, leave it on a windowsill, or you, like they say, at the door where the sunlight comes in. And for 3 days, you would let it sit in the sun and then check on it. And by then, it would sprout or germinate. So this is what it's talking about. The pit, if it doesn't cross well or cross the pit, then, so if it doesn't cross the pit, this is whenever you clean the pit and then lay it down to rest at the two-leaved gate, at the door where the sunlight is coming in. Now, and unto thee shall be his desire or cravings or inclining, his laying down. So unto thee shall be his laying down, and thou shalt rule or obtain dominion, have control over him or it. So you are responsible for the seed, watching over the seed, watching to make sure that you pay attention for when the seed is sprouting or germinating. It is your responsibility, is basically what it's saying. Now, here's the portion about pits in scientific knowledge that is important to know. Pits are thin portions of the cell wall that adjacent cells can communicate or exchange fluid through. Generally, each pit has a complementary pit, so they're side by side, okay? And it is opposite of it. Think of the right hand of the Lord, opposite of it, in a neighboring cell. These complementary cells are called pit pairs. Now, pits are composed of 3 different parts. You have the pit chamber. Think of Jesus being laid into the tomb. You have the pit aperture. I'll explain that later. I'm not sure how to say it. Oh, the pit aperture is the opening at either end of the pit chamber. So it's the doorway, okay? And then you have the pit membrane. The pit membrane is the middle lamella, or the membrane between the adjacent cell walls, okay? So it's like, here's your 2 concentric circles where they intersect at the middle, okay? That's sort of how this cellular process is done. So you have the 2 pit cells, sort of like in the concentric circles of the 153 fish prophecy, which is related to Archimedes, where he's talking about the Vesica Pisces, the bladder of a fish prophecy. It's related to the 3 days, 3 nights. There are 3 parts to a pit, so you have 3 parts of the pit in one, 3 parts of the pit in the other, 3 days, 3 nights connection. This is what it's related to. This is what it's talking about, the 3 days, 3 nights inside the ground, inside the grave, okay? It's related to the growth process. Now, there's different types of pits, like the simple pits, bordered pits, half-bordered pits, blind pits, compound pits, plasmodesmata. But basically, you can look up that information on your own. And then the relation to the verse 7 in Genesis 4, where it was talking about the clean, it says, a better approach to planting seeds is to clean and dry the seed, store the seed until December, and use a cold treatment to induce the seed to germinate. So it's related to that, the seed germination process. That's what verse 7 is about. And then we get to Genesis 4, verse 8. And it says, and Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft, talked or showed promise or made a promise with Abel, the natural flowing stream, the meadow, his chief. And it came to pass when they were in the field or the wilderness, that Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft, rose or erected up. So it came up, okay? So it erected up ornaments. Up translates to mean ornaments or traps. So it erected ornaments or traps against or on behalf of. Against can translate to mean on behalf of. Abel, the natural flowing stream. So reading it like this, I'm going to start from the beginning. I'm just going to read without the names. And the thrusting shaft showed promise with the natural flowing stream in the meadow, his chief. And it came to pass when they were in the wilderness that the thrusting shaft erected ornaments or traps. So the ornaments is probably the fruit, or maybe it's the leaves, sticky leaves, on behalf of the natural flowing stream, the endurance, the meadow, his chief, and slew him or cut him off, cast in lots, divided into pieces. Now, I want you to think about this. Do we not prune our plants? Do we not cut off pieces of our plants to plant elsewhere? So in other words, they were cutting the plant in pieces so they could replant it in different locations. So in other words, to increase the growth. Okay? Then verse 9, and the Lord, or the eternal marriage, said unto Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft, where is Abel, the natural flowing stream, the endurance, the meadow? So the one that's been cut off, divided into pieces, it's the stream, the natural flowing stream. Think of irrigation, okay? The Paleo Indians who settled along the Mississippi, along the Euphrates, along the Indus River Valley settlements, they all did irrigation to water their crops. So in other words, they cut off the stream to have it flow to their crops. In other words, they cut it off from the mouth of the river. No longer was this river just flowing straight to the mouth, to the Gulf. Now it was going down another path, not only that's not towards the Gulf, but instead it's to water their crops. So this was the first form of irrigation that it's talking about in Genesis chapter 4, verse 9. Whenever Abel is slain, verse 8, whenever he is slew or killed, he's been divided into pieces. He's been irrigated. The natural flowing stream is irrigated. And verse 9, and the eternal marriage said unto Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft, where is the natural flowing stream? The meadow, to the meadow. Thy brother or thy chief. Where's the natural flowing stream to the meadow, thy chief? And he said, I know not. Am I my chief's protector from thorns? My chief's keeper, my chief's protector from thorns? Am I my chief's watchman? Verse 10. And he said, what hast thou done? The voice, or the proclamation, the weeping one of thy chief's blood, chief's silence, chief's innocence, crieth or shouts help unto me from the ground, the threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge. It cries out. And now art thou cursed, or taking an oath. Here cursed can mean taking an oath. And now art thou taking an oath from the earth, or from the threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge. So you're taking an oath from this unoccupied place of discharge, which is now receiving water, which hath opened her mouth, or two-edged hole, the borders of the river. The mouth of the river has been opened. They have dug an irrigation system to receive thy chief's innocence from thy hand, or thy yield from thy labor. So they used their labor to reroute the river to bring forth the water to their crops. Then verse 12, when thou tillest or plow or become slave to the ground, the threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength, her fruit, and children. A fugitive or refugee on display, a fallen away one, a child, and a vagabond or wandering boaster, one driven to and fro, shalt thou be in the earth, the threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge. So let me read that without the names. So when thou plow the threshing floor, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her fruit and children. A fallen away one or wilting one, a flower, and a wandering boaster, one that's driven to and fro. Think of how plants' seeds basically fall from trees or fall from plants, and they are driven by the wind to and fro throughout the world to basically plant itself randomly. So it's no longer going to receive these random place seeds. It's no longer going to do that. Now they are going to have to plant in this area laboriously using labor. So after that, in verse 13, it says, and the thrusting shaft said into the eternal marriage, my punishment or repayment is greater than I can bear. Now think about this. By these people rerouting the river to their crops, now they have more than enough plants and more than enough crops for their entire village that they have too much. Their repayment is greater than they can bear. Behold, verse 14, thou hast driven me out this day from the face or the mouth of the river, the two edges of the earth, the threshing floor. And from thy mouth or thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive or a fallen away one, a refugee on display, a child, and a vagabond or a wandering boaster, a tramp, a scum, a harlot in the earth, threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge. So in other words, they no longer want these seeds in the ground where they're planting their actual crops. So he's been driven out. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me, or cut me off, divide me into pieces, cast me in lots. Now they're referring to the river again. And the Lord, or the eternal marriage, said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth, or cut off, or divide, cast out in lots, Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft, vengeance, or unrestrained recompense, shall be taken, or bought and paid for. So in other words, now people who choose to cut off the river, now they're having to pay to do so. They're having to pay these people for crops. It's the first bartering system. There's going to be, they have to exchange goods for these crops. Okay? Let's see. So, shall be bought and paid for on him sevenfold. That's Cain. And the threshing floor, the void place, the barn, the unoccupied place of discharge, set a mark or sacrificial offering, confession, an open profession, a writ. Think of a mark being a writ. Upon Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft. So in other words, they're now marking their crops to say, this is mine, lest any finding him should kill him or cut him off, take him without payment, without paying for it. So in other words, they're marking their belongings. This is the mark of Cain, the writ of Cain, the sign of what they would have called a writ of divorcement. So in other words, in order for someone to be able to claim this product as theirs, they would have to pay the price for it. They would have to pay whoever's growing the crops for the crops. And in exchange for whatever they were paying, they would get the food. Okay? So, from there, it says, upon Cain the spear, the thrusting shaft, lest any finding him should cut him off, and so on. Then verse 16, and Cain the spear, the thrusting shaft and light, went out from the presence of the Lord, or the eternal merit, and dwelt in the land of Nod, the wandering exile, on the east of Eden, or the east of the steppes. This would be North America. And I'm going to discuss why this would be North America in just a second. Verse 17, and Cain, the spear, the thrusting shaft and light, knew or had relations with his wife or his childbearer, and she conceived or created, became pregnant, and bare, exposed, or uncovered Enoch, the scattered word, the mouth, the two-edged river. So in other words, Enoch also means the mouth. So whenever Cain had relations, or the spear had relations with his childbearer, and it conceived or created, it uncovered the mouth, the two-edged river. And he builded or had children, a city, a threshing floor, and called the name of this city or the floor after the name of his son, Enoch, the mouth, the scattered word, the two-edged river. Now, here's the purpose of mentioning the steppes and America being the land of Eden. I mean, not Eden, of Nod. See, during the Garden of Eden stage, which is where the first garden and first greenery was, this is what caused the Ice Age. There's an article by Michael Marshall called "The First Land Plants Plunged Earth into the Ice Age." It talks about moss age. Never underestimate moss, M-O-S-S. When the simple plants first arrived on land almost 500 million years ago, they triggered both an ice age and a mass extinction of ocean life. The first land plants appeared around 470 million years ago during the Ordovician period, when life was diversifying rapidly. They were non-vascular plants like mosses and liverworts that didn't have deep roots. About 35 million years later, ice sheets briefly covered much of the planet, and a mass extinction ensued. Carbon dioxide levels probably fell sharply just before the ice arrived, but nobody knew why. Tim Linton of the University of Exeter, UK, and colleagues think the mosses and liverworts are to blame. Then it goes into moss versus rock. Now, this ice age is directly related to Cain, okay? Not to Cain, but to Adam and Eve, and their being kicked out of Eden. This ice age is that story, the being kicked out of Eden, the steppes to the east and to the Americas, where they crossed the Bering Strait. Now, What's interesting is there's also an article that says what thawed the last ice age. And this is by David Biello, and it was written on April 4th, 2012. And he says that it was not only the plants that brought the mosses and whatnot, the liverworts, that brought us into the ice age, but according to David Biello, it was the carbon emissions from the plants that were started in the Paleo-Indian age, that brought us out of the ice age, that melted the ice and whatnot. Now, I want you to go further into this. So now we have the Paleo-Indians settling the Americas, this land of Nod. Now, this is the mound culture that we have. Think of all the mound pyramids that they have in Louisiana and Mississippi and the Illinois area. This is that pyramid culture, the land of the giants area. Now, archaeologists believe that Paleo-Indians expanded into certain ice-free areas of North America's interior and its coastal margins. And the timing or arrival of them in the Great Plains and in North America in general is basically under investigation still. But they believe it started around 37,000 to 23,000 years ago. Okay? Now, if you go to Genesis 4:18, it says, and unto Enoch, it can also mean the hooked jaw, the mouth. When I say hooked jaw, think of the jaws of Leviathan. The hook in the jaws of Leviathan, written in Job chapter 41. I think it's 41. Anyway, so, and unto the hooked jaw was born Irad, or a fallen away one, a child. And Irad, the child, begat or labored with Mahujael, the destroyed one of God, or the destroyer, the firstborn messenger, the mother. And Mahujael, or the mother, begat or labored with Methusael, the man of inquisition, otherwise known as cross-examination. Think Jesus carried the cross. The man on the cross, the man of cross-examination. The mortal man of God. And Methusael, the mortal man, begat or labored with Lamech, the wild man, for lowering and humiliation. Christ, the ultimate sacrificial love offering. Whenever it says for lowering and humiliation, think of kneeling and presenting thyself to the bride, till death do they part. Just think about that. Now, I want you to think of Genesis 2:4, where it mentions the four heads in Havilah and the Pison, the Euphrates, the four main rivers. Now, if you go to a map, you'll notice that the America map also has four heads. There are the Mississippi, the Missouri River, the Ohio River, and the Arkansas River. Four heads, just as it is in Eden. Okay? Now, that being said, now we're going to go to Genesis 4, verse 19. And Lamech, the lowering, humiliated one, took unto him two wives, or childbearers. The name of the one was Adah, the appointed ornament, or garment, the wrap around covering, or the petals of a flower. And the name of the other, Zillah, the shadow of death, the fading bell, the symbol, the tingling spear. Think the stinger of a bee, the tingling spear, the fading symbol, the fading bell. As the bee goes from one flower to the next, its sound dwindles. Further away it gets from the flower, the less you hear it. This is the cross pollination process. This is the pollination of flowers. So the story of Lamech is the story of cross-pollination. He has the two childbearers, which is the flower petals, which attracts the bees, and the flower inside it, in that little area that the bee comes to, it has the ovaries or the eggs, and the bees, as they brush against the pollen, they get the pollen stuck to them, and the pollen goes and gets stuck to the ovaries in the flower, which allows for regrowth or childbearing for the plants. This is your story of Lamech. And then Genesis 4:21, and his brother's name was Jubal, a joyful sound. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. Now think of the Paleo Indians. They were the first to create instruments and music and cymbals. Rain dance, think of that. Now the Paleo Indians were not just along the North American continent. They were throughout all of Europe, along each of the major rivers. There's 4 different major rivers throughout Europe and 1 in North America. You can also include South America too, because they have a major river there known as the Amazon. Now, I want you to think of the joyful sound. It's a reference to a jubilee, the 50-year thing. So in other words, and his brother's name was Jubal or Jubilee, the 50-year period, a joyful sound. Okay? He was father of all that handle the harp and the organ, the 50-year celebration. The Indus River Valley Paleo Indians had instruments such as the 7-hole flute and various types of stringed instruments such as the Ravanahatha, and have been recovered from the Indus Valley civilization in archaeological sites. So just for your information. Okay, so Nile River Valley is one of the Indus locations. The Tigris Euphrates, the Harappan civilization in the Indus Saraswati Valley, and the Huangzhou Valley in China. 4 different areas across the European continent. And then they also had along the Mexico area and the Gulf of Mexico, area in North America. And then it also was on the western edge of South America, which is like the Mayans and the Incans and whatnot, and those pyramids that they had there. So those are the primary routes. In Genesis 4:22, you have, and Zillah, the tingling spear of the bees, she also bare or exposed or undressed Tubal Cain, the flowing forth of Cain, the flowing forth of the thrusting shaft to light, the seed of the shaft or the stem, an instructor or a caster, an archer, a shooter of every artificer or creation in brass. Within the yellow mixed substance is what brass translates to, or pollen. And iron, the piercer of holes. Think of the stinger. And the sister, or and together of Tubal Cain. So, and together with the flowing forth of the seed and the shaft and reproduction was Nama. Nama means beautiful and pleasant. So I'm going to read it all together in verse 22. And the bees, she also exposed or undressed the thrusting shaft to light, the seed of the shaft, a shooter of every creation within the yellow mixed substance and the piercer of holes, and together with the flowing forth of the seed was beautiful and pleasant. So in other words, the reproduction process of the flowers was beautiful and pleasant, just like God said in his creation in Genesis chapter 1. After everything he did, he would say, and God created light, and it was good. And God created the heavens and the stars, and it was good. This Genesis chapter 4 is just another step in the process of creation that was beautiful and pleasant and good. And that goes into Genesis 4, verses 23. And Lamech, the lower and humiliated one, the flower, said unto his wives, or the childbearers, the flower and the bee singer, hear my voice, childbearers, of the lowering, humiliated one, the wilting flower. Hearken unto my speech, for I have cut off a flower to my wounding or soreness, and a young flower, Psalms 103:15, to my hurt or writhing pain. If the thrusting shaft in light shall be repaid or exacted satisfaction sevenfold, truly Lamech, the wild man, or the wildflower, 70 and sevenfold. Now you see why bulb plants like the lilies produce less than the wildflowers. Wildflowers you see all over the field. You only see the bulb plants in like a garden type field. And Adam, the produce, knew his childbearer again, and she unwrapped a son and called his name Seth, the foundation. For God said, she hath appointed me another seed instead of the stream, whom the thrusting shaft in light cast out or gave birth to of the vineyard. So in other words, from this entire process was the birthing of a new vegetable or a new form of food. And to Seth, the foundation, to him also there was born the anointed, or a son, the anointed son, and he called his name Enos, or mortal. Then began men, or flowers, to call upon the name of the eternal marriage. So think of how when you eat your food and it's left with seeds, and they throw the seeds off into the outer fields away from everything else. Well, this kind of just scattering of the seeds ended up bringing forth new types of plants, cross-pollination, basically just natural flowing new plants. So that is your story of Cain and Abel in the prophecy interpretation, prophetic interpretation. So I hope that this has brought you to think on a new light. The stories within the scripture are true. They are actually the bringing forth of crops and the bringing forth of the first foods of earth and the creation of earth. And it's not just the creation of earth. You can actually translate that another way to where instead of it being the pollination of flowers, it could be mankind pollinating each other. That's the reason why the Hebrew language has multiple meanings for each of their symbols and each of their words. You can't just go by the story having a single meaning, because many of the words have alternate meanings, as you could clearly tell. Eden doesn't have to mean just a name. It can mean the steppes or the plains. It's literally a recording of history back in the day. They were jotting down the way that they were able to survive, able to create new plants, able to start irrigation, civilization. This literally is the story of how civilization first came to be from their own mouths. And I can go more, but I'm going to stop there because I just want you to watch this video and get the idea that many people have translated scripture incorrectly, and they don't actually know the official locations of where even the reason that they can't find things like Solomon's temple is because they're not looking in the right places. They haven't translated scripture correctly, so therefore they're incorrectly searching. And they're claiming certain places to be something that they aren't. So that's for another video, though. I'm going to discuss that as I go along. So thank you for watching, and I hope that whoever watches this video has learned something new. Thank you.